Imagine this. You're in a crowded room. The air is thick with conversation, laughter, and invisible contracts of expectation. People tug at your attention with words wrapped in urgency, requests, obligations, subtle manipulations posing as friendship. You smile reflexively, offer help you didn't mean, nod when you want to scream. The weight isn't physical, but it's there, 1,000 invisible strings, pulling your soul in directions that feel less and less like your own. Now, imagine just once you say no, not with malice, not with rage, just a calm, unapologetic withdrawal. You let the message go unanswered. You turn the phone face down. You decline the invitation. You step outside the performance. And something changes, not just in the reactions of others, but in the atmosphere itself. Some people grow cold. Some lash out, confused by the sudden lack of your availability, as if your presence had become a currency they felt entitled to. Others quietly begin to retreat, as if your value was contingent on your accessibility. The phone rings less. Invitations fade. Praise withers. The silence begins to echo, and you're left standing in it, startled, liberated, but haunted by a question you never dared to ask until now. What part of you was real, and what part of you was simply a response to being wanted? Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But what if your identity, everything you thought you were, is built not from essence, but from accommodation? Have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped making yourself available? Not out of cruelty or ego, but from a deep spiritual need to reclaim your own center. What if the constant accessibility, the nods, the favors, the anxious yeses were never acts of kindness, but acts of self-erasure? And deeper still, what if the world doesn't actually love you? It only loves what it uses in you. You begin to question everything. Was your warmth ever truly seen, or simply harvested? Was your helpfulness a virtue, or a survival tactic? Was your constant presence evidence of your compassion, or your quiet, unconscious fear of abandonment? These questions gnaw at the seams of your identity. What if availability, the kind you've given so freely, isn't noble? It's a symptom of a deeper hunger, to be needed, to be chosen, to matter. But here lies the great paradox. The more available you make yourself, the less valuable you often become. And the moment you withdraw, even slightly, you start to see it. People who once relied on you vanish. People who once praised you grow resentful. And those few who remain, they begin to see you, not as a function, not as a mirror, not as a fix, but as a person. So the question emerges, urgent and brutal. Who are you when no one needs anything from you? If you stripped away all the roles you've performed, friend, fixer, peacemaker, confidant, therapist, clown, soldier, what would be left? Would you recognize that face in the mirror, or would it feel like a stranger's? And if that self, buried beneath the noise and needs of others, could finally speak, what would it say? Would it whisper gratitude for your courage to reclaim it? Or would it cry, trembling from years of neglect, asking why you made everyone else more real than yourself? The ancient mystics, the psychologists, the philosophers, they all knew something that modern life makes easy to forget. Constant availability is spiritual death, because to be constantly available is to fracture the self into 1,000 open doors, each leading away from the sacred core of who you are. But what happens when those doors begin to close? When you begin to say, "No, not today. No, not this version of me. No, I am not your solution." What tectonic shifts begin to occur, internally and externally? Here's the deeper riddle. In being always available, have you made yourself invisible? And in becoming less available, might you become more real, not just to others, but to yourself? This is not about arrogance. This is not selfishness. This is the quiet revolution of drawing a line around your soul and saying, "Here I begin, and here I end." But why is this so hard? Why does drawing boundaries feel like betrayal? Why does choosing yourself feel like you're harming others? What unseen force deep within our psyche and society makes us believe that self-sacrifice is a moral virtue, even when it kills the very self it claims to serve? To understand that, we must descend into the roots of the illusion, into the invisible architecture of identity, fear, and longing, into the unconscious contracts we signed before we ever knew we had a choice. Because when you stop being available, everything changes. But before that moment comes, something must be understood. There is a lie so deeply embedded into your psyche that you rarely even notice it. Like a low hum beneath all your actions. It doesn't scream, it whispers, and its whisper is seductive. If you are always there for others, you will be loved. If you are good, helpful, reliable, then you will be safe. This belief doesn't come from nowhere. It has roots twisted deep into childhood, into culture, into the collective myths of what it means to be worthy. Before you even had language, you learned the rules of survival, not in words, but in reactions. A parent smiles when you please them. They frown when you assert yourself. You cry and are ignored. You smile and are praised. Over time, your being is shaped, not by your essence, but by what brings you acceptance. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear to fit the expectations of the outer world. It's not inherently bad. The persona helps you navigate society. It helps you find belonging. But the danger comes when you forget that it is a mask, when you confuse it for yourself. And most of us do. We become so fluent in meeting others' needs, in adjusting to their moods, in avoiding their disapproval, that we lose sight of what we want, what we feel, what we are. Availability becomes a currency, one we spend in exchange for love, approval, or mere tolerance. Friedrich Nietzsche warned of this when he said, "He who despises himself still respects himself as one who despises." There is a subtle self-hatred buried in over-availability, because to constantly give yourself away is to imply that you are not worthy of being protected. It's to say, I exist for others, not for myself. And over time, that becomes not just a behavior, but an identity. This is the psychological trap. You begin to equate presence with value. You believe that if you disappear, so does your worth. So you stay. You answer the call even when you're exhausted. You show up even when your soul begs for solitude. You say yes, not because you mean it, but because the silence of rejection terrifies you. And underneath all this, there's something darker, something existential. Jean-Paul Sartre once said, "Hell is other people." But what if the real hell is who you become around other people? The truth is, we are afraid to be alone with ourselves, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, because in that silence, in that withdrawal from external validation, we confront the terrifying possibility that we have no idea who we are without someone needing us. Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of suffering, described the human condition as a pendulum swinging between pain and boredom. And in the middle, perhaps, lies the constant distraction of being needed. It gives us something to do, someone to be. It postpones the reckoning. But how did we get here? Why is our identity so dependent on our usefulness to others? Part of the answer lies in the architecture of society itself. From childhood, we are conditioned into roles: student, sibling, helper, performer. We're rewarded for obedience, not for introspection. We're taught how to succeed, not how to be. And in a world obsessed with productivity and performance, availability becomes a virtue. You are taught to be reachable, teachable, employable. You are trained to answer the call, reply to the email, say yes to the opportunity, even if it devours your time, your peace, your soul. And when you finally say no, when you decide not to perform, not to produce, not to be convenient, something shatters. Not just in your social circles, but within you. Because that no awakens a terrifying question. If I am not what others need me to be, then who am I? Viktor Frankl, who survived the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, discovered something vital in the midst of horror. That meaning does not come from what others demand of us, but from what we choose in response to our suffering. And often the greatest suffering is this slow erosion of the self, not through violence, but through the subtle decay of always being available, always being agreeable, always being everything but yourself. The danger of overavailability is not just burnout, it is spiritual amnesia. You forget your center, you forget your instincts, you forget that you have the right to say, I choose me. Carl Jung warned of this in his concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, rather than who the world expects you to be. But individuation is a painful rebellion. It means disappointing people. It means silence where there was once applause. It means facing the reality that some relationships were built not on love, but on what you provided. So you begin to see it. This is not just about saying no to others. It's about saying yes to the parts of yourself you abandoned long ago. The part that values solitude, the part that desires more than performance. The part that is not afraid to be alone, because in that aloneness, it hears its own voice clearly. But the world won't let you do this easily. It will shame you for stepping back. It will guilt you with labels, selfish, cold, distant, and the most dangerous part, you might believe them, because the habit of self-abandonment runs deep. You were trained to betray yourself with a smile. You were praised for self-sacrifice. And you were told that being needed was the same as being loved. But what if that's the core illusion? What if being needed isn't love at all, but a cage gilded in praise? And what if love, real love, can only exist when you are whole and sovereign, not dependent on the roles you play? You've seen the mask. You've felt its weight, and now, standing at the edge of the truth, the ground begins to tremble. Because to stop being available is not just an act of resistance, it is an act of becoming. But becoming what? What happens when you cross that threshold and let the old identities fall away? What waits on the other side of silence and solitude? To see it clearly, you must face the unseen consequences, the ones hiding beneath comfort and compliance. And that is where we go next. Silence is not empty. It is filled with everything you've been avoiding. When you begin to withdraw from the endless demands, the constant texts, the unspoken expectations, what you're left with is not peace. Not at first. What you're left with is a revelation, the crushing realization of how much of your identity has been outsourced. You begin to see the invisible machinery you were a part of, one that never needed you to be whole, only useful. At first, you might mistake this for loneliness, but it's not, it's exposure. You are now face to face with yourself, without armor, without the flattering reflections of others, without your usual distractions. And what you find there is not always comforting, because here's the truth. Most people spend a lifetime running from. Being needed is not the same as being loved. And worse, being loved is not always safe. You start to notice the transactions embedded in your relationships, the conditional warmth, the subtle punishments when you don't comply, the weaponized silence. You realize how many smiles were contracts, how many gestures came with price tags. You weren't in community. You were in a marketplace of emotional labor. This is one of the most disorienting awakenings of the human experience. We are, all of us, born into stories we didn't write, roles we never auditioned for, expectations that were silently grafted onto our skin until we couldn't tell where the world ended and we began. And when you start to reclaim your time, your presence, your sovereignty, the consequences ripple outward, not gently, but violently. The very fabric of your life begins to shift. Relationships dissolve. People grow hostile. Even your own body rebels. Suddenly you feel anxious, uncertain, disoriented, because for so long your nervous system was regulated by external approval. When that disappears, you don't feel free. You feel untethered. This is not failure. This is the detox. Your brain, wired through years of conditioning, interprets this new quiet as a threat. It panics. It floods you with cortisol because no one is asking for you. No one is calling. No one is needing. To your limbic system, this feels like death. And in a sense, it is. The death of the persona. The death of the illusion. Cognitive dissonance sets in. How could pulling back feel so wrong if it's supposed to be right? Why does reclaiming myself feel like I'm losing everything? This is the psychic withdrawal from the drug of availability. You were addicted to being needed because it created the illusion of worth. But an identity built on utility is a house built on sand. Eventually, it crumbles. And yet, society tells you the opposite. We are conditioned, culturally, neurobiologically, spiritually, to believe that availability equals virtue, especially for certain identities. Women, caretakers, empaths, creatives. The message is clear. Your job is to be open, software responsive, always on call, always giving. It's no coincidence. An accessible person is easier to control. A predictable person is easier to exploit. An ever-agreeable person is less likely to rebel. So when you withdraw, when you reclaim time, space, solitude, you are not just stepping away from relationships. You are stepping away from systems of power. You are confronting the entire architecture of performative identity. And the consequences are not just personal, they are structural. People begin to treat you differently, not because you've changed, but because your silence exposes their dependence on your availability. You'll hear things like, "You've changed. You're being distant. Why are you so cold now?" But listen closely. What they are really saying is, "I don't know how to control you anymore." This is the hidden cost of becoming whole. You lose the roles that once gave you meaning. The emotional economy that once sustained you collapses, and you're left with a void. But that void is not empty. It's sacred. It's a space waiting to be filled not with performance, but with truth. Neurologically, this transformation is real. When you remove external validation as your primary feedback loop, your brain begins to rewire. The prefrontal cortex, the center of your autonomy and long-term decision-making, activates more deeply. Your amygdala, the fear center, begins to calm. Over time, you become less reactive, less needy, less addicted to approval. But during the shift, you may feel like you're falling because the scaffold that held your false self together is gone. Carl Jung described this process as the night sea journey, the descent into the unconscious, the confrontation with the shadow, the integration of the parts you once abandoned. He warned that individuation is not enlightenment. It is not light and love and affirmation. It is chaos, contradiction, terror, and ultimately rebirth. You begin to see your own behaviors in new light. How often you over-explained yourself to avoid disapproval. How you gave more than you had because guilt was stronger than self-respect. How you tolerated misalignment just to keep the peace. And you realize you were not peaceful. You were performing peace. You were not being loving. You were disarming conflict. And you were not being yourself. You were being useful. This realization cuts deep, but it also opens the door because now you are free, not in the way the world defines it, but in the ancient existential sense. You are no longer governed by obligation masquerading as love. You begin to ask, What does it mean to give freely, not compulsively? What does it mean to love without dissolving? What does it mean to exist not for others, but for yourself? These are not selfish questions. They are the foundation of true selfhood. The unseen consequences of stopping your availability are not just social or emotional. They are ontological. They change the very question of what it means to be. But the journey is not complete. You've seen the illusion. You've felt the backlash. You've endured the quiet devastation of walking away from the version of yourself others depended on. Now the question becomes, what do you build in the aftermath? What new rules? What new self? What new life? And that is where the rebellion begins. It begins with something small, a message unanswered, a phone call ignored, a smile withheld when it isn't true. At first, it feels unnatural, like trying to breathe underwater. The guilt comes roaring in, feral and loud. What if they're mad? What if they think I'm selfish? What if I lose them? But guilt is not always a compass. Sometimes guilt is the ghost of your conditioning, a phantom whisper telling you to get back in line, to keep being useful, agreeable, compliant. This is the moment you must rebel, not with fire and fury, but with stillness, with space, with the courage to be misunderstood. Because make no mistake, this rebellion will make you misunderstood. You're not just setting boundaries, you're dismantling the entire psychological architecture of who you've been. And the first thing to collapse is permission. You've been taught to ask for it your whole life, before speaking, resting, declining. But freedom does not ask, it simply acts. So here is the radical act. You stop explaining yourself. No over-apologizing, no justifications, no softening your truth to make it more palatable. You say no without a novel. You say I don't want to without guilt. You say I need space and mean it. This is not coldness. It is clarity. And clarity is a form of love, a love that includes you. The rebellion is not about becoming harder. It's about becoming softer, but only where it counts. It's about being tender with yourself, even if others don't understand. The world is not built for sovereign people. It is built for compliant ones. So when you begin to honor your own energy, your own time, your own truth, you disrupt the system, and the system fights back. People accuse you of being arrogant, of not caring, of thinking you're better. But their outrage is a mirror. It reveals how dependent they were on your silence, your flexibility, your inability to say no. This is your crucible. Do you fold, or do you stay the course? Because if you stay, if you keep walking through the fire, you find something extraordinary on the other side. Yourself, not the persona, not the role, not the performance, but the core. And this core is not for sale. It does not shift with public opinion. It does not apologize for existing. It simply is. Carl Jung called this emergence the self, the totality of the conscious and unconscious unified and whole. Not fractured by people-pleasing, not diluted by approval-seeking. The self is what you return to when all performances collapse. But the journey to the self demands sacrifices. You will lose relationships, especially those built on your availability, not your authenticity. You will disappoint people who only loved the version of you that served them. You will feel grief, not just for others, but for the version of you who never got to rest, who never got to say enough. And yet, in this grief, something blooms, a new rhythm, a new center, a new standard. You begin to act from alignment, not obligation. You begin to discern between true connection and energetic theft. You begin to choose when to show up instead of being compulsively available. This is not detachment, it's maturity. It's knowing the difference between service and self-erasure. And you begin to see the others, the ones like you who stopped performing, who stop sacrificing themselves on the altar of being liked. You recognize them by their eyes. Clear, grounded, not desperate. They do not overextend. They do not chase. They do not pretend. These are the quiet revolutionaries, the ones who stopped begging for seats at tables where authenticity was unwelcome, the ones who built their own. And you realize you're not alone. You never were. There is a secret fellowship of those who have stepped out of the matrix of usefulness, who have reclaimed the sacred art of being. And from this place, you give differently. You love not because you fear being abandoned, but because your heart overflows. You help not because you need to be needed, but because your soul says yes. You show up not out of guilt, but because you've made a sovereign choice. This is the paradox. When you stop being compulsively available, you become truly present. You begin to experience love without conditions, silence without shame, solitude without emptiness. And your relationships, they transform. Those who remain begin to meet you at your level, not as someone to lean on, but someone to stand beside, not for what you give, but for who you are. You find yourself saying things like, "I don't owe you access to me. My energy is sacred. I'm not available for that." And you say them without anger, without guilt, just truth. Truth becomes your compass, not obligation, not approval, not fear. This is the rebellion Jung spoke of, not against others, but against the lie that you must abandon yourself to be accepted. You no longer live in reaction. You live in response, intentional, grounded, whole. And from this grounded place, a final question arises. If you're no longer the sum of what others expect from you, if your worth is not defined by availability, then what remains? What is the ultimate truth hidden behind this entire journey? The insight that collapses the old world and gives birth to something eternal. To find it, you must stand at the edge of your former self and leap. You leap, not because you're fearless, but because the ground behind you no longer exists. And as you fall through the void, between the self you were and the self you are becoming, you realize something staggering. There is no applause in this place, no validation, no audience. There is only you. And for the first time, you are not performing, not managing perceptions, not negotiating your presence like a currency. You are being, and here, in this radical stillness, the ultimate truth begins to reveal itself, not as a whisper, but as a thunderous recognition crashing through every illusion you've ever lived. You were never meant to be available to everyone. You were meant to be available to truth. It hits you like a wave that had always been approaching. Only now you're finally still enough to feel it. Every time you overgave, overshared, overcommitted. Every time you said yes when your soul screamed no. You weren't being kind. You were betraying yourself, because what you called love was often fear. What you called loyalty was survival. What you called connection was a contract based on your silence. You didn't lose yourself. You gave yourself away, piece by piece, hoping someone would finally say, "Now you are enough." But enoughness was never out there. It was buried beneath the rubble of your false self. Carl Jung wrote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This addiction to being available, agreeable, needed, was never your fate. It was your unconscious wound acting as a compass. You mistook your own abandonment for love. You mistook exhaustion for purpose. You mistook being seen for being known. But here's the truth that breaks the spell. You are not here to be consumed. You are here to be realized. That's the most dangerous realization you can have in a world built on transaction, because a realized person is ungovernable. They don't beg, they don't chase, they don't betray themselves for belonging. They create belonging by existing fully. And here's the miracle, the paradox that unravels everything. When you stop making yourself available to the world's projections, you become available to something far greater. Your inner voice, your intuition, your essence. You begin to operate from the center, not the edges, from soul, not strategy, from depth, not desperation. You find that truth is not loud. It doesn't shout, it waits like a stone in your chest, waiting for you to stop long enough to feel it. And when you do, everything recalibrates. You no longer ask, do they like me? You ask, am I in integrity with myself? You no longer wonder, how do I keep them? You ask, does this honor my wholeness? You no longer fear being alone, because you realize solitude is not emptiness, it is sanctuary. And from this sanctuary, you begin to create, not out of hunger for approval, but out of overflow, out of clarity, out of sacred yes. This is where true artistry begins. This is where real relationships form. This is where your life stops being a reaction and becomes a creation. You no longer need to be available. You need to be attuned to your soul, your limits, your calling. And the people who meet you here, they don't drain you. They witness you because you've taught them how to treat you, not with fear, but with reverence. This is not selfishness. This is sacred economics. Only giving what doesn't cost you your soul, and it changes everything. You begin to see how the entire system was built on self-abandonment, how industries thrive on your insecurity, how institutions depend on your compliance, how entire cultures idolize self-erasure and call it virtue. But when you stand fully in your center, you become immune to these forces, not because you fight them, but because you no longer feed them. Your silence becomes a revolution. Your no becomes a prayer. Your boundaries become altars where only truth is welcome. And the world shifts in response, not immediately, not easily, but irreversibly. Because when one person becomes sovereign, they give permission to others to do the same. You start to notice the cracks in the facade, the moments when someone else pauses before saying yes, the hesitations, the quiet rebellions, the slow awakening. You're no longer alone in the void. You are part of something ancient and holy, the reclamation of soul in a world addicted to surfaces. And now you understand why everything changed when you stopped being available. It wasn't about others, it was about you. It was never about what you lost, it was about what you remembered. You remembered that you are not a product, not a projection, not a service, not a mirror. You are a being, a boundary, a blazing center of awareness that does not owe itself to anything that dishonors it. And in this, the final revelation unfolds like scripture written in fire. Your life is not a reaction. It is a declaration, so declare it, not in words, but in how you choose to live, how you choose to rest, how you choose to say no, how you choose to be whole in a world that profits from your fracture. Let your unavailability be your greatest offering, not a retreat, but a return, not an escape, but a homecoming. And when the world asks, why have you changed?